Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. Unless people have been living under a rock, educators know that freedom of speech issues, book banning has become an issue in K-12 education. I really wanted to bring somebody on to talk about, are there any alternatives to book banning and what can happen if we actually do continue on this pathway? My next guest is Amanda Jones. Amanda is the author of the new book, That Librarian, The Fight Against Book Banning in America. She is also a very well-noted librarian in Louisiana. Currently, she is the chapter counselor for Louisiana for the American Library Association, and she is former president of the Louisiana Association of School Librarians. No one better to talk about the effect that book banning has had on her personally in her career. And perhaps we could talk about some alternatives to book banning that still do take into account parent concerns that might be out there for certain materials that our students are reading. I'd love to get Amanda's take on maybe some alternatives to how we do that, but still maintain the integrity of informational freedom. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Always glad to have people such as yourself on. What inspired you to become a librarian?
My mom's a retired kindergarten teacher, and she took us to the public library every single week growing up. And she, in fact, not just myself and my two sisters, she would take our friends too. So we would all go. And actually, I'm still friends with one of my childhood friends, and we talk about that, our love of reading. And my mom, her mother had cancer and couldn't bring her. And so she went with me and my family. And my mom always read to us every night. We grew up, we had the little records that you listen to. It would ding and you turn the page to the book. We're just big readers. My dad's a big reader. Reading was important to everybody in my family, and education is important to everyone in my family. I wanted to be surrounded by that as an adult and do the same thing as a career, teach reading and stories and books and literature. And so I became an English language arts teacher first, and for 14 years, and I've been a school librarian for 10 now. So I've been at the same school for 24 years.
I know that some of our listeners will have some idea of the following, but can you tell us in your words, in your opinion, why libraries, particularly school libraries, are essential in K-12 education?
Speaking from my own experience, I'm the only person at my school that teaches every single kid in the entire school. Actively teach. I don't just check out books. I actively teach every single kid in the school. And I actively work with every single faculty member on campus, coordinating resources and planning lessons. Libraries, I always said I wanted the school library to be the heart of my school. There's a lot of things that a certified school librarian brings to the table. We are the resource. We know how, usually we're at the forefront of the technology, and we can tell you about all the different programs and websites and databases, but we also know about literature, and we watch lists, and we know what's current and what the kids are going to like, and we read reviews. And something else about why it's important to have a school library is if you look at any type of studies that are done on students, and I'm thinking off the top of my head, the 2023 Human Rights Coalition did a study in which they asked students if they felt safe at school. And there was a large percentage of students that say, no, they do not feel safe at school. And then they followed that with the question, where do you feel the safest? And 9 out of 10 said the school library. To me, that means it's very important to have a school library with a certified school librarian who knows what they're doing there at the helm.
Now, You've been an advocate for intellectual freedom on the national stage, not only your book, but I believe it was at the 2023 National Book Awards ceremony that Oprah Winfrey even gave you a shout out. Now that's high praise. I've seen articles with you, interviews with you in People magazine. You've obviously have a passion, and your passion is to really make sure that people understand the importance of intellectual freedom and why we need to guard against book bans. Can you tell us a little bit about why this passion? Why are you going out talking against book bans? And how has this impacted your life?
Well, I've always been very outspoken in the need for diverse literature. There's a quote by Dr. Rooney Sims Bishop that says books should be windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And I've always taken that to heart. Every kid in our school deserves to see themselves and their families reflected in the characters on the shelves. And I've always advocated for that. I became what I call an accidental advocate or an accidental activist in 2022. I went to my public library board meeting as a resident of my community that just so happened to be a school librarian. I've lived in my community now 46 years. I went and spoke because there were censorship attempts in my public library, and I became the target of extremists, death threats, and just horrible things circulating in my community about me, a real targeted harassment campaign where I was already advocating for diverse literature and for students, every kid to be represented in the books and their families on the shelves. When I became a target, two things. Number one, I had a platform. In 2021, I was the National School Librarian of the Year. When you're given a platform like that, you use it for good or it's a waste of a platform. So I decided, well, just use it. But also because I was being targeted and harassed, it was important for me to get my story and my side out. And that took the shape of when I tell my story, I tell why I was outspoken in the first place, which is how I became an accidental activist. And so I do go and speak about why book banning and censorship attempts are wrong.
What do you think the impact is of book bans, particularly on our students?
There are several things happening right now. Censorship attempts right now that are happening where books are being challenged at schools, which is every parent's right. And just like it's every community member's right to ask a library to reconsider a book that's on the shelves, that's everybody's right. But what we're seeing is that if someone challenges a book, and these challenges sometimes are done by parents that are well-meaning and really concerned for their own child, but more often than not, what we're seeing is mass book challenges by extremist groups that are not parent. And if you look at the books that they're challenging, the vast majority of them are by authors or with characters of color or from the LGBTQ plus community. When you remove a book from a shelf, I've seen a book by Ruby Bridges challenged and removed from shelves. You're telling the students of color that they don't need to be in the school either. That's the message, that they shouldn't belong. If you're taking out books with LGBTQ characters, you're telling those students in their school that they shouldn't exist either. That's the message you're sending, and that there's something wrong with them. When you have books that are written by authors from the Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC communities, and you're removing all of those books, you're saying, well, your race is not acceptable. It's not just an attack on books, it's an attack on people. It's an othering, and it's an attempt to silence voices. When you ban books or when you challenge books, it's a ripple effect because librarians get scared because not only are books being challenged in bans, but there's actual legislation being passed in multiple states that say librarians can be imprisoned for having sexually explicit content. Well, librarians do not have sexually explicit content, but what that does is it makes librarians scared. And these laws are vague and they don't define what they're talking about. And so you have people overcorrecting and pulling way more books than the law requires, and you have librarians scared to do their own jobs and order books. I know librarians myself that will not order books with gay characters or about racism because they're scared of going to jail.
Let's talk a little bit then about what would be, in your opinion, like you said, you're an accidental advocate, but you've learned a lot in this journey. And I'm sure there are, and I mean, we're going to talk about some alternatives to book banning to still ensure that students are safe. But let's stick so far with the train of thought that book banning is bad and that it does have these negative effects that you just mentioned, particularly on students in feeling accepted and as part of a community. You become this advocate. You saw that this was wrong, you spoke up, you used your platform. What advice would you give educators, which include librarians, how to fight back on potential book bans and calls to recall books?
First and foremost, librarians, we have classes on how to do this, whereas a classroom teacher hasn't. In the school libraries, we have collection development policies. And so we're guided by purchases, book purchases that go on our shelves. We're guided by professional reviews. And most collection development policies state that you have to have two professional reviews that say the book in question is geared towards the age level of your students. We already do that. But a lot of classroom teachers have classroom libraries, and they might not necessarily use professional reviews. I know when I was a classroom teacher, I was just taking whatever books I could get. So I would say if you have a classroom library, be very wary. There are websites that you can use. Tidal Wave, Mackin, Bound to Bound, Permabound are some websites that you can have a free account and you can look up books and see what the professionals say about the age range. Protect yourself. The school librarians are already protected. We already do that. So this notion that we have inappropriate books that are out of range for our children, if you have a certified school librarian, that's not happening. However, because of funding cuts across the US, you will see school librarians who have not been trained. They'll take a paraeducator. No disrespect to paraeducators, because there are some paraeducators doing outstanding jobs as school in the role of school librarians, but they didn't necessarily take all the classes and understand the importance of a collection development policy. What is a collection? Even if you're not a librarian, look at what that means. Look at the National Council for Teachers of English, look at their website. They talk a lot about books and protecting yourself. And then there's organizations like PEN America, which is for free speech. Look at what they say. There's a lot of guides for educators on what to do, how to speak out, how to protect yourself, and how to make sure you're doing what is appropriate in your role as an educator or a librarian.
I love all the resources you gave, Amanda, because I think those are going to be very helpful to classroom teachers, particularly because most English classes I go into have a classroom library, which is a great thing, but to ensure that the teacher is protecting themselves. Unfortunately, you've had a really rough go of it with those threats. What advice would you give others? So let's say whether they're a librarian or a classroom teacher, they get a challenge or somebody challenges them on a book in their collection or a book in the library, and they make it personal by issuing death threats. What advice do you have for others like you who had that experience?
My advice is to be proactive so that you don't have to be reactive. It's not a matter of if, it's when. Even if it's not around a book, you're going to have at some point in your career now with the rise of social media, you're going to have a parent make some sort of false accusation or get riled up about something. And it's going to be like the scene from Beauty and the Beast where the pitchforks are out and they're all going after to go kill the beast. And you're going to be dragged through the mud in social media. That happens all the time. And so you want to prepare yourself for things like that because it can get very personal. As far as school goes, talk to your administrators now. If you're an educator that doesn't know, go ask your school librarian or your administrator, do we have policies? What is the procedure for if someone challenges a book? It is their right. So I believe in parental rights. And I think it is every person's right. It's the parent's right to challenge a book on the shelf or challenge something in the curriculum. But as an educator, it's important that we know how to handle that. So we need to know the policies and procedures, and we need to follow those to a T. We can't go rogue and do whatever we want. We should follow the policies set forth by the school board. Personally, it's really hard. In this day and age of social media, most educators are on social media. You need to lock it down. I used to share about my child all the time. I don't. There's a simple thing by going in your settings and retroactively setting every post to either private or friends only and cull your friendship list. You don't need to be friends with everybody, people you don't know and that you do not trust. And I know that you want to gather up as many friends on social media as you can, but it opens the door to extremists into your life. So be very careful. I'm going to reference PEN America again. They do have a harassment guide for educators. Go and look that up so that you know what to do if it happens. And don't ever react or respond on social media. I would even hesitate to say don't respond on your school email, these sensitive topics, unless you've discussed it with an administrator first.
So then, Amanda, you're talking about parents having a right to challenge books, that this isn't about ignoring concerns that a book is inappropriate. If one is a parent, you yourself are a parent, how should a parent go about registering a complaint? And then how should the school handle that complaint?
As a parent, what I do and what I would like for parents to do with me is just have a conversation first. That's not what we're seeing, though. We're seeing people go online and start attacking educators without having a conversation. We're in this together. Educators aren't the enemy, parents aren't the enemy. We're all, hopefully, all wanting to work together to help these tiny little humans become grown-ups and become productive, empathetic, kind citizens in the world. And so it takes us working together. Conversation is needed first. All you have to do is simply call the educator, call the librarian. Anytime a parent says, hey, I have a question about XYZ, I'll call him. Let's talk about it. Every single time a parent has ever emailed or called me, we have been able to resolve the issue almost immediately. Every single time. If you go online and post about it, I'm going to put my guard up immediately and not want to have a conversation with you. I will, because I'm a professional, but I question the motivation behind that if you go to social media first. If it can't be resolved with a simple conversation, that's when, as a librarian, I say, okay, I understand. I can offer you this. I can help your child find books. What are some books that you would like to see your child have? And what does your child like to read? And I can help steer them to those books that are more or what that family is looking for. I have no problem with that. With the understanding from the parent, though, that I have not read every single book. If you don't like something, just turn it back in. If that doesn't help, we have an official challenge form. So I would say to that parent, okay, fill this out. And usually the way a challenge or a reconsideration form works is that there's usually a committee formed at school, and that committee reads the book and decides as a whole, and they determine if the book is going to stay in that location or if it's going to be removed. And whatever that decision is, that either the parent or whoever, generally the parent they don't like that answer either, and they can go to the school board and they can keep going higher until it's resolved. But to me, I say, well, just have a conversation with the librarian. I'm there to help. I'm not trying to, hurt you or your child. And I understand that there are books that your family might not want to read, and that's okay. We don't all have to like the same things, but that doesn't mean I'm going to remove a book just because someone calls and says, there's a gay character. I don't like this. Take it off the shelf. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell them follow the policy.
I hear you. I'm going to give you an example of something that happened in a school near here. There's a local school here in the New York City tri-state area where the teachers and the librarian decided that a certain book, which I do believe had gay characters, would be limited to middle school students, to particularly eighth graders. And they had the book behind the circulation desk. So a student had to go up and request this book. In this particular case, a seventh or a sixth grader came up to the desk and asked the librarian for the book. The librarian did not give that child the book because they were not an eighth grader, and that is what the committee decided was the appropriate age for this book. Even though the child was denied the book, the parent of the child was still very upset that that book was in the middle school library in the first place. That person contacted the board, and then the board made the decision to remove that book from the middle school and brought it to the high school. In your opinion, what might have been perhaps a better way to handle that situation?
As a professional librarian who has recently been looking at court precedent, I know that there was a Supreme Court case that set the precedent that that is not allowed. You're not allowed to have books sequestered. There could have been a parent who said, I want that book not sequestered, and they could have filed a lawsuit. I don't know if it's Supreme Court, but there's court precedent that, and I wish I could quote you the case. I was talking about it 2 days ago. But there is a court case that you cannot sequester books like that. They're either open for everyone or they're not there. There are some schools that it's difficult. I have a friend that is a librarian in a pre-K through 12th grade school. That is very hard when you've got kindergartners and you've also got high schoolers trying to use the same library. Even if you're talking about a 6th through 12th school or a 7th through 12th grade school, this is very hard because what an 18-year-old senior in high school is reading is very different from what a 10, 11, 12-year-old is reading. To really weigh into it, I'd have to know specifics, but follow your policy. If your school has a collection development policy and you are using professional reviews that say, and there is a Supreme Court case, and I wish I knew the name of this one. I keep saying Supreme Court. There is a district, I don't know how high it went, but there is a court case that sets a precedent in schools that say you can have books in your library that are geared towards the oldest student. It's very complicated. It's not always a black and white issue. But again, could that have been resolved if the parent had had a conversation? I wonder that.
Let's say a child does come up, wants to take out a book that you know is not appropriate for them. So I mentioned that example of that school. Let's say a fifth grade or a fourth grade student does come up with that book that is the research says or the researchers say is more for a seventh and eighth grader. How do librarians handle that?
It's hard for me to answer that because my kids are all 9, 10, and 11, so there's not a big age range. But you tend to know your readers and your students. It's a little harder if you're at a school that's very large, but I know which kids are reading and what they're reading. So if a kid that normally reads Junie B. Jones is coming up to me all of a sudden wanting to read War and Peace, I'm going to question that. Not because I don't want them to check it out, because they can check out whatever they want. It's that I want to say, this book, you might not be interested in this book. I want you to love the book that you're checking out. So it might not be a good fit for you. I would still let them check it out if it's professionally reviewed for the age range of children at my school. It's all about knowing the readers and knowing the families. And I know some parents at my school that have said, I don't want my kids to check out XYZ. And I have had a kid come up to me and with one of those books, and I just would say, it's in this library and you can check it out. However, I have talked to your mom and she's not comfortable with this book. What do you think? And they'll usually say on their own, yeah, you're right. I should probably go get another one. I've had one say, can we call my mom and ask? And I say, yes, we can. So we will call your mom and we will ask. And the parent was, oh, yeah, that's okay. But it's all about conversations, and there has to be open dialogue from both sides.
Amanda, looking at how teachers could work with librarians to have an effective partnership, what are some ways that classroom teachers should be working with librarians?
One of my most favorite parts of the job is getting to work with the classroom teachers. I love providing as many resources as possible. I think a lot of classroom teachers don't want to bother us, but a lot of us are just waiting. Ask us, we'll help you. Well, hopefully they work with a librarian that's willing to help them, but ask. We're a wealth of knowledge and we can help. I would say though, especially in the day and age with the censorship, especially if you have a classroom library. I've actually had that at my school. A teacher said to me, you know more about reviews of books and the current state of books. Can you come just look through my classroom library? And so I went through and I looked. I noticed right off the bat 2 or 3 books that I said, we're a 5th and 6th grade school. And I know off the top of my head that these books are written for high schoolers. So you should probably not have these in your classroom library for 5th and 6th graders. Now, are there some parents that would allow their children to read that? Yes, my mom would have she let me read anything. But it's, again, you should have books that are age relevant for the kids in your class or your school, because when you have books that are written for high schoolers in a 5th and 6th grade classroom, that's just setting yourself up, because that's not appropriate to have a high school book in an elementary classroom.
I'm glad that you mentioned that teachers do have that resource to work with librarians to make sure that the resources they are using are age appropriate for their particular students. What about projects? Are there any ways that you would recommend classroom teachers work with librarians in terms of bringing in extra resources during project development? What does that look like? Or what does an effective classroom teacher, librarian partnership look like?
Oh, I love it. So I love this. This is what we do. I'll say this, a school librarian can only do what their administrator lets them do, and an administrator can make or break a school library. I am fortunate that I have a very good administrator that understands the importance of our library. As an example today, our sixth grade social studies class has been learning about the American Revolution and taxation without representation. I team taught. I coordinated a lesson. I asked what standards they wanted to cover, and I team taught a lesson with the sixth grade social studies teacher, and they came in and we did a mock taxation without representation activity where the kids were all given beans and they had to pay taxes to Parliament and the Crown and whatever. But it devolved into straight into a lesson on primary source documents and examining primary source documents from the American Revolution. I knew where to look for these primary source documents that are going to help teach these standards that these kids have been learning. Another one we did in science, the fifth grade science, they wanted to come to the library and book a day. And so I said, what standards are you covering? And they were covering matter, states of matter. So we did an experiment. The kids did experiments, and then we used a database to look up different stages of matter. And then I had a book display with all of our science books on matter. And I showed them how to use their public library e-cards to access more materials at the public library and how they could get models and simulations and games involving the same thing at the public library even. A good school librarian that is allowed by their principal should always be working with teachers to coordinate and team teach lessons in the library when they can. But it looks different. In elementary, your librarians tend to be what's considered the specials rotation. They only have the time to check books in and out. But in the middle school or high school, they have blocks and you can do more. If your administrator and your schedule allows you, you should always be team teaching and helping provide resources and activities. We do virtual reality. We take virtual field trips through playing animal cells, green screen work, where they'll have to reenact scenes from history after they've researched them in front of the green screen. There's so much you can do in a library.
I love that. And in fact, I'm going to do a plug for an earlier episode. I just had an episode on co-teaching strategies. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm going to tell our listeners, go back and listen to that. And then I hope to have an episode on virtual field trips, along with an episode on book clubs, summer book clubs. That's coming too. Amanda, we've talked about a lot of different things. What else do you want listeners to know?
Well, we are underutilized school librarians. I will say that librarians champion free speech for a reason. When you have bad things happen throughout history, when you start shutting off the access to knowledge, we are the people that are protecting the knowledge. It's a little different in a school library compared to the public library, but librarians in general should always champion intellectual freedom. There's this misconception that I see out in the public where people are always posting on social media. If you champion intellectual freedom, you must be for, oh, well, that person's woke. They're all giving kids sexually explicit materials. No, that's not the case. But as a professional, I realize that when you set laws, like we're seeing in states that criminalize librarians and they say sexually explicit material and they'll list it as a nude figure. Well, I do virtual field trips to the Sistine Chapel. That's a standard for our sixth grade social studies. Me taking them on a virtual field trip to the Sistine Chapel is not me giving them sexually explicit material. Look at these laws that are being passed. And what I need people to understand also is that there is a very large push across the United States to devalue teachers and librarians. There is a push to privatize schools, to defund public libraries for privatized institutions. When you start going private and you start going charter, not that I think there's anything inherently wrong with those, our students that are protected, maybe they have their differing abilities or different races or different protected classes, will not be protected as much in those places. So that's why it's very important for us to stick up for public schools and for public libraries.
Amanda, where can people find out more about you and the amazing work you do?
I have a website, librarianjones.com. I'm on Blue Sky, at librarianjones.com, and I'm on Instagram at that librarian Jones.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for your time today. This has been a very interesting and informative conversation.
Thanks for having me anytime.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.